Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at the successors to the Mongol Empire, particularly in South and Southwest Asia. This is kind of kicking us off into our unit on the Gunpowder Empires. So, our essential question: what is the lasting legacy of the Mongol Empire in this region? Let's back up. The Mongol Empire was, of course, huge. It took over most of Asia, except for South Asia, the far north, and a little bit of Southwest Asia. They pretty much dominated this continent from the Sea of Japan over here all the way over to Eastern Europe. The Mongols had this massive control, and they'd also unified the Silk Road, which meant the free flow of knowledge and goods between Eastern and Western Asia, and a lot of this transference into Europe and Africa as well. Now, the survivors of this Mongol expansion, because of course the Mongol expansion itself was a brutal thing and a lot of people didn't survive it. But once you were on the interior of this empire and no longer subject to the same warfare that the borders would face, you really benefited from new technologies, internal peace, wealth, prosperity. It was good to live inside the empire. That is until the empire itself fractures. The Mongol power began to fracture with the division of the empire by four of Genghis Khan's grandchildren. And we wound up having the creation of these four distinct areas, some of which will hold together a little bit better, a little bit longer than others, and some will fracture themselves pretty quickly. The leaders of each of these areas, in China, they took on a different title. They became more imperial Chinese dynasties and took on all those trappings. But in other areas, they became the leaders of khanates. So we had the Khanate of the Golden Horde, the Empire of the Ilkhans, and the Chagadai Khanate. The Khanate just meaning it was under the leadership of a Khan. But these Khanates themselves would fracture and divide into other pieces, which further weakens the centralized power of the Mongols. This gets accelerated with the Black Death. When the Black Death hits in the mid-1300s, the Khans, who are already fracturing a little bit, were even more severely weakened. Because keep in mind, they are a Mongol elite, a small group at the top of a hierarchy where they are ruling people of other cultures, other traditions, right? In the Ilkhanate, it was a small group of Mongols ruling a bunch of Persians and Arabs who have their own traditions, their own history, and they're only backing or tolerating the Mongol leaders because they're afraid of a unified Mongol response being devastating to themselves. But once this centralized power starts to weaken, once the empire starts to fracture, and especially once the Mongol armies themselves are decimated by the Black Death, we see more rebellions jumping up. And this is true all along the Silk Road. But for this unit, we're going to be focusing a lot about what is happening in the old Ilkhanate, which itself is incredibly fractured even before the Black Death arrives. And these separate khanates will just completely collapse. So, following the collapse of the Ilkhanate, in particular, the Southwest Asia becomes very fractured, very chaotic, very dangerous as these different factions are fighting against each other. And that is until the one person kind of steps up and seizes control and kind of reconquers this old Khanate. And that person is Timur right here. You'll also hear him referred to as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame. And he steps up and he creates this whole new empire. Now, Timur probably falsely claimed to be a descendant of Genghis Khan. The evidence on there kind of suggests that he probably wasn't. But if you're trying to, claim heritage, divine right, whatever, tying yourself back to a former great unifying power is not a bad thing to do. So Tamerlane steps up, says, I'm the descendant of Genghis Khan. Who else is better to end the chaos and reunite the area. And he is very successful. He creates this new empire of Timur in the area. But the problem is he follows a Turkic tradition which called for the dividing of his land amongst multiple successors. So we have this unifying force that as soon as he is gone, starts to fracture. It starts to fracture right away. And by the time we get a couple of generations from Timur, the Timurid Empire is a ghost of itself, a memory. It's a part of history, not a part of the present. All right, so the Ottoman Empire, we're going to get into this one in much greater detail later, but it does arise out of this teeny tiny little territory here from a man named Osman. And it arises because of the decline of the Seljuks. Now, the Seljuk Sultanate had used to control a huge area, but they are getting beaten up by the Mongol Ilkhanate. And they're very distracted by what's happening to their east. And so we get a lot of breakaway territories arising as the Seljuks are weakening. Now, the Ottomans are going to benefit from this Seljuk withdrawal and then the Seljuk decline, the Byzantine inability to do anything significant to respond to the decline of the Seljuks, and then the Mongols themselves whipping through this area and then themselves fracturing. So there is nothing left on their eastern flank to seriously threaten the rise of the Ottomans. And to the west, the Byzantines are weak. Now, the Timurids did arise as a serious threat once they unify this area. But the Ottomans, by that point, have had enough time to sort of establish themselves, move into Byzantine territory more. They've got enough of a foothold that once the Timurid threat disappears, the Ottomans will explode onto the world scene and take over almost the entire, well, no, they'll take over the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The Safavid Empire, or Safavid dynasty, is really it's a Persian empire with these Turkic, Azerbaijani, anyway, it's complicated, but they wind up being a Persian empire led by a Safavid dynasty. And they are in good position to take advantage of the collapse and decline of the Timurids. So they kind of govern the same area as the old Timurid dynasty, which is now fractured. And coming out of Azerbaijan in the north, the Safavid dynasty is able to gobble up all these fracturing pieces and create their own dynasty out of the wreckage of Timur's. They govern mostly what we can think of today as modern Iran, with periods of controlling modern Iraq as well, and periods of controlling Afghanistan. And this becomes the Safavid Empire, and modern Iran kind of traces their heritage back to this dynasty. The final one we'll discuss is the Mughal Empire. They begin as a small successor state to the Timurid Empire. Their leader, Babur, was one of the descendants of Timur and had control of one of those fractured pieces. But in the chaos of the collapse of this, they don't push west toward the expanding Safavids. Instead, they start to push east and focus on India itself. And over time, the Mughals will succeed where the Mongols failed and where the Timurids failed as well. The Mughals will conquer India and will be in charge of India for a period of a couple hundred years. All right, that's it for this kind of introduction to the unit. We'll be getting into those pieces in much greater detail in the future. I hope you did learn something today, and farewell.